Ambrose Bierce was a larger-than-life figure in late 19th century America. Born in 1842 and raised in Indiana, he survived combat as a young Union soldier, an experience that left an indelible mark and shaped the dark, unflinching tone of his writing. After his time in the Army, Bierce became a journalist and author in San Francisco, where his razor-sharp wit and merciless satire earned him the nickname Bitter Bierce. He was celebrated for such works as An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge and for The Devil's Dictionary. By 1913, Bierce had a hard-won reputation as a brilliant but cynical man of letters. He was known for skewering the powerful and exposing corruption in print. Yet behind the public persona lay personal tragedy and weariness. His marriage had ended in divorce, and 2 of his children had perished, leaving him largely alone in his old age. In his 70s, he remained intellectually vigorous, but had grown deeply disillusioned. Rather than slipping quietly into retirement, Ambrose Bierce chose to embark on one last grand adventure. In the autumn of 1913, after settling his affairs, Ambrose Bierce set off from Washington, D.C., on a journey that would be his last. He toured parts of the states, including where he fought as a Union soldier, almost as a farewell pilgrimage through the landscapes of his youth, before heading toward Mexico. He passed through New Orleans and Texas, crossing the Rio Grande into Chihuahua by late 1913. At that time, Mexico was in the throes of revolution, and the northern states were engulfed in fighting between rebel forces and the regime of President Victoriano Huerta. The famed revolutionary general Francisco Pancho Villa was leading a rebel army in the north, and Bierce aimed to find him. Many friends were alarmed that a man in his 70s would ride into an active conflict zone, but Bierce wouldn't be deterred. To friends and family, he explained that he wanted to see what was really going on in Mexico for himself. He informed them that he was thinking about writing a book based upon what he planned on seeing. As he traveled south, Bierce sent letters home that revealed his grim sense of humor about what might await him. In one letter, he joked that if he ended up, quote, stood against a Mexican stone wall and shot to rags, he would consider it a pretty good way to depart from life. Dark as it was, he apparently meant what he said. By December 1913, the 71-year-old Bierce had crossed into northern Mexico and caught up with Pancho Villa's army. He reportedly met the rebel leader and even witnessed the Battle of Tierra Blanca, one of Pancho Villa's major engagements that fall. From the city of Chihuahua on December 26, 1913, Bierce wrote a final letter to a close friend. In it, he casually noted, quote, I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination. That unknown destination would mark the end of his story. After that letter, Ambrose Bierce vanished without a trace. By early 1914, when no more letters or news came from Bierce, speculation about his fate began to spread in the press and among the public. In the absence of any confirmed account, historians and enthusiasts have put forward several theories to explain what might have happened to the famed writer. One leading theory is that Bierce died in the chaos of the Mexican Revolution. In fact, in early January 1914, Villa's troops stormed the border town of Ojinaga in a major battle against Mexican federal forces. If Bierce was present during that fight, or a similar skirmish, he could have been struck down by a bullet or shell during combat. Should he have fallen on a remote battlefield, news of his death might simply never have made it back to the United States. In that case, the old warrior-turned-writer would have met the end he seemed to seek. Another possibility is that Bierce was captured and eliminated. Some accounts claim that Pancho Villa became suspicious of the American in his midst. According to one story, Bierce mentioned leaving to meet one of his adversaries, which prompted Pancho Villa to order him slain as a potential spy or turncoat. Alternatively, Bierce might have fallen into the hands of Mexican federal troops who could have summarily eliminated him as a potential foreign spy. Others believe he may have essentially fallen victim to a roving group of bandits eager to exploit the chaos of the Mexican Revolution. Another suggestion is that Ambrose Bierce's grim sense of humor, combined with his very limited understanding of Spanish, could have led to an unfortunate misunderstanding. Of course, in the ruthless environment of that revolution, any of these grim scenarios is plausible. A very different theory suggests Bierce succumbed to illness or injury while trying to return home. Decades later, locals in the Texas border town of Marfa told of an old American who perished from pneumonia in early 1914 after crossing north from Mexico. This man supposedly called himself Ambrosia and spoke of having written books. According to one of the people who met him, he had even mentioned one with the word devil in the title. According to this account, he succumbed to pneumonia and was buried anonymously on Texan soil. If this story is true, it remains possible that his remains may one day be discovered in a pauper's grave in Marfa. Of course, the mystery of Ambrose Bierce's fate has also inspired some more unlikely legends. Some claim that he deliberately staged his own disappearance, in essence to write a real-life mysterious final chapter for himself. Under this theory, he may have lived out the remainder of his life in Mexico, or he may have made his way further to the west, with some speculating that he settled in Arizona. Despite countless investigations and wild tales, more than a century has passed without any definitive proof of Ambrose Bierce's ultimate fate. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to hit that like button, subscribe, and also turn on all notifications. Amelia Earhart was more than a pioneering aviator. She was an American icon. Born in Kansas in 1897 with an adventurous spirit, she took to the skies in her 20s and quickly broke barriers in the male-dominated field of aviation. In 1932, Earhart became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, a feat that made headlines worldwide. She went on to set numerous records, including a solo flight from Hawaii to California, and her charisma and courage made her an international celebrity. Using her fame to champion women's opportunities in aviation, Earhart became a symbol of bravery and new possibilities for a generation of young women. By 1937, Earhart had set her sights on her most ambitious journey yet, a flight around the world at the equator. She and navigator Fred Noonan planned to circumnavigate the globe in a twin-engine Lockheed Electra, making stops to refuel along the way. After nearly completing the arduous trek from Miami through South America, Africa, India, and Southeast Asia, they reached Lae in New Guinea. On July 2nd, 1937, they departed Lae for a tiny speck of land in the Pacific, Howland Island, which was to be their next refueling stop. A U.S. Coast Guard ship, the Ithaca, waited off Howland to guide them in by radio. But as Earhart's plane neared the area, she radioed that she was low on fuel and couldn't find Howland. The Ithaca could hear her transmissions, but she couldn't hear their replies. Earhart's last known message described a navigational line she was following, followed by silence. An extensive search by the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard, the largest of its kind at the time, scoured the ocean around Howland Island and beyond for weeks. However, they found no trace of the plane or its crew. With nothing to show for their efforts, officials concluded that the aircraft had simply run out of fuel and crashed at sea. This crash and sink explanation was accepted as the likely end of her journey. Yet the lack of concrete evidence left room for doubt, and over the years, a number of alternative theories emerged to fill that void. What follows are the leading theories about what might have happened on that fateful day in 1937. The most straightforward theory is that Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Electra ran out of fuel near Howland Island and fell into the Pacific Ocean. In this scenario, Earhart and Noonan, unable to spot their tiny target island, would have been forced down into open water once their fuel was exhausted. A water landing in rough seas could have torn the plane apart or sent it straight to the ocean floor. Given the vast expanse of the Pacific and its strong currents, it's not surprising that searchers in 1937 found no trace of debris. Earhart's final radio calls support this idea. She never mentioned seeing land, and her last reported navigation line would have carried the plane far past Howland into empty ocean. Many historians have long considered the crash at sea narrative the most plausible explanation. Another theory proposes that Earhart and Noonan might have landed safely on an uninhabited coral atoll, then called Gardner Island, now called Nikumaroro. According to this theory, the pair survived there for some time as castaways. The idea is that when they couldn't find Howland, Earhart turned the plane southeast along the line she had mentioned in her last transmission, hoping to find land. Gardner Island lies about 350 miles in that direction. In 1937 it was deserted, but it offered a long flat reef at low tide that could have been used as an emergency runway. It's conceivable that Earhart spotted this island, brought the plane down on the reef, and sent out distress radio calls until the rising tide swept the plane into the sea. In fact, in the days after the disappearance, some radio stations picked up faint distress signals that were never fully explained. In 1940, a British officer discovered skeletal remains on the island, along with a portion of a shoe and some navigational equipment. At the time, investigators concluded the bones were from a man who didn't meet the description of Noonan, and were obviously not from Earhart, and the remains were unfortunately lost. However, modern analysis of the original bone measurements suggests they could have belonged to a woman of European descent about Earhart's height. Unfortunately, this was based upon a reanalysis of the measurements from 1940, not a re-examination of the bones themselves as they were lost. Had the bones been maintained, it may have been possible to tie them to Earhart's family through forensic genetic genealogy. Unfortunately, unless these lost remains are recovered, we simply don't have this luxury. A very different hypothesis is that Earhart's final landing wasn't on a friendly island at all, but in territory controlled by Japan, leading to her capture. In 1937, Japan administered the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, not far north of Earhart's intended route. Some believe that Earhart and Noonan, unable to find Howland, might have drifted off course and ended up in the Marshalls. According to this theory, the Japanese military would have taken them into custody, possibly suspecting them of espionage, given rising pre-war tensions. Indeed, over the years, a few islanders and U.S. servicemen claimed they had seen or heard of two American flyers held by the Japanese before World War II. One persistent rumor placed Earhart on Saipan as a prisoner. However, no credible documentation has ever surfaced to support these claims. In fact, a blurry photograph emerged in 2017 that supposedly showed Earhart and Noonan in Japanese custody. A History Channel show called Amelia Earhart, The Lost Evidence, claimed that the photograph was taken in 1937. However, after the claim was made, a Japanese blogger found that the photograph actually came from a book published in 1935, 2 years prior to the disappearance of Earhart and Noonan. Whatever the case, the disappearance of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan remains one of the most famous and haunting mysterious disappearances in history. In late 1809, as the Napoleonic Wars ravaged Europe, a 25-year-old British diplomat named Benjamin Bathurst set out on a tense journey home. Bathurst was the well-connected son of a bishop and already a seasoned envoy despite his age. He had just left Vienna, where he'd tried in vain to draw Austria into an alliance against Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, with Austria defeated, Bathurst feared French spies were on his trail. Disguised as a humble merchant and traveling under a false name, he planned to slip north through Prussia to the port of Hamburg and sail back to England. It was a risky route. The roads were crawling with bandits and stray soldiers, and every town posed new dangers for a lone British envoy behind enemy lines. On the evening of November 25, 1809, Bathurst's carriage halted at the Prussian town of Perleberg for a brief rest. He and his courier, a man named Herr Kraus, had dinner at the White Swan Inn, while fresh horses were being readied for the next leg of their trip. Bathurst was cautious. He had decided to depart under cover of darkness, hoping the night would cloak his passage. Ever on edge, he peered into the gloom and was wary of every flicker of shadow around the inn yard. At around 9 p.m., with the carriage waiting in the lamplit courtyard, Bathurst donned his heavy fur coat and stepped outside. Witnesses later recalled seeing him walk around to the front of his horses, perhaps to inspect the team or speak to the carriage driver. In that fleeting moment, the young diplomat vanished. When Kraus emerged moments later, there was no sign of Bathurst anywhere. One moment Bathurst was there beside the horses, the next he had melted into the shadows without a sound. Local authorities were notified, but in the chaos of Napoleonic-era Prussia, a missing traveler raised little alarm at first. However, when the Prussians, who were officially neutral at this point, learned that the man wasn't a merchant, but a British diplomat, this caught the attention of the local authorities. By the next day, Captain Friedrich von Klitzing had soldiers dragging the nearby river and combing Perleberg for any trace of the Englishman. Their search soon turned up disturbing clues. Bathurst's fur-lined cloak was found hidden in a stable behind a house owned by an inn worker. 2 weeks later, a pair of his trousers surfaced in the woods outside town. Oddly, the pants had strange holes in them and contained papers including a letter to Bathurst's wife, but there were no bloodstains. It looked like someone had fired shots through the clothing after removing it, perhaps to fake a violent ambush. Suspicion ended up falling on a member of the inn's staff, August Schmidt. He was caught with the missing coat and promptly arrested, but no body or weapon was found, and he was eventually released without charges. And I just have to mention it here, but this expensive coat was found in an outhouse owned by the Schmidt family. So yeah, sometimes the comedy just writes itself, doesn't it? Desperate for answers, Bathurst's wife, Phillida, traveled to Prussia and even secured an audience with Napoleon Bonaparte to ask if he knew of her husband's fate. Napoleon solemnly denied any French involvement, and indeed no hard evidence ever tied French agents to the disappearance. The Prussian king and British government posted hefty rewards for information, yet every lead turned cold. As the winter of 1809 wore on, Benjamin Bathurst had effectively vanished without a trace, leaving behind only unanswered questions. In the absence of a definitive answer, numerous theories emerged to explain his disappearance. The simplest and most mundane explanation is that Bathurst was robbed and slain by opportunists. He was traveling with conspicuous wealth, a fine coat, jewelry, money, through an area that had been impoverished by war. It's easy to imagine him stepping away from the inn's lights and being ambushed in the darkness by thieves. The suspicious conduct of the inn's employees and the fact that the wealth seems to have been distributed amongst them supports this idea. The fact that he wasn't openly traveling as a diplomat also lends some additional credibility to the theory. I imagine the inn staff would have seen a wealthy merchant as much easier pickings than an influential and well-connected British diplomat on official business on the continent. But guys, I'm going to dox myself a bit here. I'm not a Prussian waiter at an inn circa the Napoleonic era, so this is just speculation on my part. I know some of you are probably shocked right now, but yeah, I just gotta speak my truth. Years later, in 1852, workers demolishing a nearby building discovered a human skeleton buried under a threshold, the skull split by a heavy blow. Many believed that Bathurst had finally been found, though at the time there was no way to prove this was him, and the evidence wasn't preserved. At the time, public opinion favored a more conspiratorial view, that Bathurst was the victim of an attack by French agents. As a British envoy working against Napoleon, he could have been targeted. British newspapers loudly accused Napoleon's spies of abducting Bathurst, suggesting he'd been seized and quietly eliminated on official orders. The French government angrily refuted these charges, instead insinuating that Bathurst had gone insane. The French government further accused the British diplomatic service of routinely employing people who are in poor mental health. They even released an official statement saying that the British diplomatic service is well known worldwide for employing madmen, which I suppose passed for 19th century French banter. Despite extensive diplomatic inquiries, no proof ever emerged that France captured or in any other way interfered with Bathurst. As I mentioned earlier, Napoleon personally guaranteed to Bathurst's wife that Bathurst hadn't been harmed by French agents. Given the context at the time, this didn't satisfy many in Britain. However, these inquiries were raised again after Napoleon's fall, and again officials denied all involvement in the disappearance. Further, historians find it highly unlikely that Napoleon would have ordered a diplomat to be abducted and slain. The reasoning for this is grounded in practicality. All sides in any conflict know that diplomats are necessary, and neither side wishes to have their people treated in such a way. Another theory suggests that Bathurst took the opportunity to leave his life behind and live on the continent. Under intense stress and fearing for his life, it's possible he suffered a mental breakdown or decided to desert his mission. Friends noted that in his final days, he was extremely anxious, even paranoid, about being followed. Indeed, the letter Bathurst left for his wife, recovered from his abandoned trousers, was reportedly disjointed and desperate, as if he felt surrounded by enemies. Perhaps he lost his nerve and fled into hiding. One rumor claimed that an unidentified Englishman fitting Bathurst's description turned up in a Baltic port that winter, refusing to give his name, and boarded a ship for Sweden. According to this unverified narrative, the vessel sank in a storm. Despite the intense stress he was under, most experts agree that there's simply no indication that he chose to willingly run off. Notably, in modern times, the story of Benjamin Bathurst has found new life, with an infusion of paranormal influence. Given that he disappeared under such bizarre circumstances, some have speculated that he may have slipped through time. That said, ultimately, there's no indication that such an event ever occurred. Over 2 centuries later, the disappearance of Benjamin Bathurst remains an enduring mystery. The most likely conclusion, that he was slain by local robbers in Prussia, is also the least sensational, but it fits best with the sparse facts we have. Yet without definitive proof or witnesses, absolute certainty has eluded all investigations. No culprit was ever identified, and no grave was ever officially confirmed.